Most people think identity theft happens in the dark by a stranger in a foreign country. They are wrong. The worst kind of theft happens in broad daylight by the people who taught you how to walk. They steal your name, they drain your future, and then they sit across from you at Sunday dinner and ask you to pass the sweet tea. My parents opened 6 credit cards in my name, racked up $87,000 in debt, and used it to fund my sister's designer lifestyle. But that money was just a smokescreen for a much larger betrayal. This is the story of how I stopped yelling and started collecting paperwork. Welcome back to QT Told Stories. Get comfortable, grab your coffee. If a family member has ever expected you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm, drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. You are going to love how this ends. The screen says you owe $87,000, Evelyn, but that makes no sense. I have known you since you were in pigtails, and you have never owned a credit card. Mr. Abernathy stopped typing. The rhythmic clatter of his keyboard gave way to the steady, hollow ticking of the wall clock behind his desk. Outside the thick glass of the bank window, the suffocating humidity of an Alabama July baked the asphalt. Inside this office, the air conditioning hummed sterile and freezing. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap. The rust-colored Alabama clay was worked permanently into the creases of my knuckles. It was a quiet testament to my reality. I am a soil agronomist. For 6 years, my life has been measured in pH balances, root density, and drought-resistant crop engineering. I trust dirt because it follows rules. It yields exactly what you cultivate. If you poison the soil, the crop dies. The math is always fair. I had walked into First Mobile Bank 30 minutes earlier to sign the closing papers on a 60-acre research farm in Baldwin County. I had saved for a decade. My financial record was a pristine blank slate. I lived in a small rented cabin, drove a 10-year-old truck, and poured every spare cent into a high-yield savings account. The farm was supposed to be mine today. "Turn the monitor, please," I said. My voice did not shake. I did not gasp or clutch my chest. I just watched the heavy plastic screen pivot toward me. There were 6 premium credit lines listed in stark black text. Platinum accounts, high-yield rewards cards. Every single one was drawn to its maximum limit, flagged in red, and sitting in 60-day default. The numbers stared back at me as a sterile calculation of ruin tied directly to my Social Security number. "Print it," I told him. Mr. Abernathy hesitated, his brow furrowed with paternal concern. "Evelyn, this is severe identity theft. We need to freeze your bureau files and call the local authorities right now. Whoever stole your data went on a spree. Just print the itemized statements, Mr. Abernathy." The printer whirred to life. It spat out 20 pages of warm, crisp paper. I picked up the stack. I did not read the total balance again. I bypassed the interest rates and the late fees. I scanned straight for the transaction dates and the primary billing address. The dates lined up with eerie precision. April through June. Those were the exact months I spent isolated in an off-grid testing field in the northern part of the state. I was running trials on a new proprietary seed hybrid. I had been out of cellular range. I was disconnected from the world and focused entirely on the breakthrough that was going to define my career. I had left my mail forwarding and emergency contacts with my mother. It was the perfect window of time to bleed me dry. Then I looked at the billing address. The statements were not going to a shell corporation. They were not being mailed to a hacker in a different state. Every single invoice, every late notice, and every statement of debt was being routed to an immaculate white-pillared colonial estate in the wealthiest zip code in Mobile, Alabama. My parents' house. I traced the address with my dirt-stained index finger. The contrast was sharp. The luxury purchases listed on the pages did not belong to a soil scientist. $4,000 for first-class flights to Milan, $7,000 at a boutique in Atlanta, $5,000 for high-end photography equipment, These were not random purchases. They belonged to someone cultivating an image. They belonged to Savannah. Savannah is my younger sister. She is 24 years old and views reality through a ring light. She is the portfolio child. Our parents, Vivian and Winston, always balanced the scales of their affection with a twisted sense of equity. I was born resilient. I learned to read early. I solved my own problems. Because I did not demand rescuing, they assumed I did not require love. Savannah was born needing an audience. She stumbled through high school, quit 3 different colleges, and required constant emotional and financial bailouts. In my mother's eyes, my strength was a surplus that could be mined to subsidize my sister's weakness. I looked at the folded paper in my hand. The sheer audacity of the theft was breathtaking. They did not just borrow a few $100s to cover a rent payment. They systematically opened 6 different lines of credit using my Social Security number, my pristine credit score, and my flawless payment history. They maxed them out in 90 days. They destroyed a decade of my financial discipline so Savannah could take aesthetic photos on a balcony in Italy. "Evelyn," Mr. Abernathy said softly. He reached for his desk phone. "Do you want me to get the fraud department on the line?" I folded the 20 pages precisely in half. I stood up. The leather of the chair groaned in the quiet room. "No, thank you," I said. I slid the stack into my canvas work bag. "It is not a bank error. I know exactly where the money went." I walked out of the freezing office and into the blinding southern heat. The humidity hit my face like a wet towel. I climbed into the cab of my truck. I tossed the folded credit report onto the passenger seat. I turned the ignition and listened to the engine rumble to life. I did not drive back to my lab. I did not go home to cry. Crying is a waste of hydration, and anger without a plan is just a tantrum. I put the truck in gear and merged onto the highway. I headed straight toward my parents' house. It was Sunday. The dining room table would be set with fine china and sweet tea. They were expecting me for dinner. They thought I was coming to celebrate buying my farm. They had no idea that I already knew they had burned my farm to the ground to keep my sister warm. I drove the speed limit. My hands rested at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I watched the familiar Alabama pines blur past my window. I thought about the farm in Baldwin County. I had walked the property line just last week. I had knelt in the soil and tested the moisture. I had drawn up blueprints for the irrigation system. That farm was not just a piece of land. It was the culmination of my entire professional existence. It was the sanctuary where I was going to finalize the agricultural patent I had spent 6 years developing. Now the bank held the deed, and I held $87,000 of my sister's European vacation. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother. It read, "Dinner is at 6, honey. Savannah made a lovely salad. We cannot wait to hear all about your boring dirt farm." I stared at the glowing text. The word boring stood out to me. Vivian always used small adjectives to shrink my accomplishments. It was her way of keeping the ecosystem of our family intact. Savannah was the star, and I was the stagehand. I did not reply to the text message. I let the screen go dark. I pulled into the gated entrance of their subdivision. The houses here were monuments to old Southern money and carefully curated appearances. Manicured lawns stretched out like green carpets. Sprinkler systems ticked in rhythmic unison, wasting clean water on decorative grass. It was a neighborhood built on the illusion of perfection. I parked my dusty work truck behind Savannah's brand new imported SUV in the sweeping circular driveway. The SUV had dealer plates. I realized with a cold, sharp clarity that I was probably paying the interest rate on that vehicle too. I turned off the engine. I sat in the quiet cab for a long moment. I did not feel panic. I felt a deep cold settling into my chest, the kind of cold that preserves things. I reached over and picked up the printed bank statements. The paper felt heavy. It was a weapon they had carelessly handed to me. I opened the truck door and stepped out into the stifling heat. I walked up the brick pathway toward the grand front doors. I was not the naive daughter they thought they had cornered. I was a scientist, walking into a contaminated field, preparing to cut out the rot. The heavy oak front door of my parents' house was unlocked. It always was on Sundays. I pushed it open and the climate-controlled air washed over me. It smelled of roasted pecans and expensive lavender candles. The house was a temple dedicated to the preservation of appearances. High vaulted ceilings, sweeping staircases, and pristine white wainscoting that never bore a single fingerprint. From the back patio, I could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of a pop song and the splash of pool water. That would be Savannah, resting from the exhausting labor of spending my credit score. I walked down the hall and stepped into the kitchen. The room was bathed in golden afternoon light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Vivian, my mother, stood at the center of the sprawling Carrera marble island. She was wearing a silk blouse under a crisp floral apron. A glass pitcher of sweet tea, sweating with condensation, sat on a silver tray next to a crystal vase. She held a pair of silver pruning shears in her right hand and a flawless white rose in her left. Snip! The metal blade sliced through a green thorn. The sharp barb dropped onto the marble counter. "Evelyn, darling," she said without looking up, "you are tracking dust onto the hardwood. We are eating in the formal dining room tonight, so please, go wash your hands. Your father is upstairs taking a conference call, but he will be down shortly." I did not look at the floor. I walked to the edge of the marble island. I opened my canvas work bag. I pulled out the 20 pages of bank statements and laid them flat on the counter, directly next to the pile of severed rose thorns. "I think we need to talk about my hands later," I said. "Right now, we need to talk about this." Vivian set the rose down. She picked up a linen towel and wiped her fingers with slow, deliberate grace. She looked at the top page of the credit report. She saw the bold red lettering indicating the 60-day defaults. She saw the total balance of $87,000. She did not gasp. Her breath did not catch. Her pulse did not flutter in her throat. She simply sighed. It was a soft, disappointed sound, as if I had brought home a stray dog that she now had to shoo away. "Oh, Evelyn," she murmured. She reached for the pitcher and poured a tall glass of sweet tea. The ice cubes clinked cheerfully against the glass. "Mr. Abernathy at the bank is such a busybody. He really should not have bothered you with this on a Sunday. We were going to tell you over dessert." The sheer casualness of her response felt like a physical blow. I watched her push the glass of tea toward me across the marble. It was her favorite weapon, Southern hospitality used as a shield. If she was pouring a drink and smiling, then nothing ugly could possibly be happening. "You stole my Social Security number," I said. My voice remained flat. I did not match her polite cadence. "You opened 6 separate lines of credit in my name. You drew them to their limits. You defaulted on the payments. I was denied the mortgage on my research farm 2 hours ago because the bank views me as a crushing liability." "Do not use such ugly words in this house, Evelyn," she chided softly. "Nobody stole anything. It was a clerical family favor, nothing more." "A clerical favor," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. Vivian picked up the shears again. She pulled another white rose from a plastic bucket on the floor. She examined the stem. "Savannah needed a little boost, honey. She is launching a sustainable lifestyle brand, an eco-startup. It requires seed money, legal fees, branding packages. You know how hard it is for her to get approved for anything after that messy business with her last apartment lease. We just borrowed your financial history for a few short months. A temporary umbrella to get her out of the rain." She snipped another thorn. It fell to the counter. $87,000 is not an umbrella, Mother, I said. It is felony wire fraud. Savannah bought first-class tickets to Milan. She bought designer luggage. How does luxury luggage launch an eco-startup? Vivian paused. Her manicured fingers tightened slightly around the silver handles of the shears. She hated being challenged with specifics. Specifics ruined the aesthetic of her narratives. "Image is everything in her industry, Evelyn," she said. Her tone grew a fraction colder, losing some of the syrupy sweetness. "You would not understand that. You spend your days digging in the dirt, wearing the same pair of boots you bought 3 years ago. Savannah operates in a world where perception dictates value. She had to look the part to attract the right investors. Your father and I were just leveling the playing field." Leveling the playing field. The phrase echoed in my mind. That was the core of their twisted math. Because I had built a stable life through grueling labor and discipline, they felt entitled to harvest my stability and feed it to my sister. "I will be reporting this to the authorities tomorrow morning," I said. I kept my posture rigid. I did not lean over the counter. I did not invade her space. "I want you to understand the timeline. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow to figure out how you are going to explain this to a detective." Vivian stopped pruning. She set the shears down. She placed both hands flat on the marble island and leaned toward me. The smile vanished entirely. It was replaced by the calculating matriarch who ran our family like a corporate dictatorship. "You will do no such thing," she said. Her voice was a low, warning whisper. "Family does not press charges against family. You will absorb this temporary inconvenience like a mature adult. Your father is liquidating some stocks next quarter, and we will quietly pay off the balances. In the meantime, you will simply wait to buy your little farm. A few months' delay will not kill your plants. Savannah's entire future depends on this launch. You are strong enough to carry this weight for her." I stared into her eyes. They were a pale, icy blue. There was no maternal warmth in them. There was only strategic assessment. She was measuring my compliance. Then she did something strange. The anger smoothed out of her face. It was replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. She picked up her glass of iced tea and took a slow sip. "Speaking of your agricultural projects," Vivian said, smoothly pivoting the conversation with whiplash speed, "how is the filing process going for that new soil formula of yours, the drought-resistant seed coating you have been obsessing over?" I blinked. The pivot was so abrupt it felt disorienting. Vivian had never once asked me a specific question about my agronomy research. To her, my career was a cute hobby involving mud. She usually referred to my life's work as my little dirt projects. Now she was asking about the legal filing status of my proprietary formula. "Why are you asking about my patent filing?" I asked. "Just taking an interest in my daughter's life," she smiled. It was a tight, rehearsed smile. "I read an article the other day about how easily intellectual property can be stolen if the legal protections are not locked in tight. Have you finalized the paperwork yet? Did the patent office issue your registration numbers?" A cold shiver traced its way down my spine. The air conditioning in the kitchen suddenly felt biting. My mother did not read articles about intellectual property law. My mother read architecture digests and country club newsletters. The specificity of her questions felt like a probe testing a perimeter for weaknesses. "The protections are in place," I lied smoothly. My voice betrayed nothing. "Everything is legally secured under my name." Vivian nodded. A brief flicker of something crossed her face. It looked like disappointment, or perhaps calculation. "Well, that is good to hear," she murmured. "We just want to make sure your assets are safe, darling. It is a cruel world out there." She picked up the silver shears and returned to her roses. The conversation was over in her mind. She had issued her commands. I was supposed to quietly assume nearly $100,000 of fraudulent debt, put my own dreams on hold indefinitely, and smile politely at dinner while my sister wore designer clothes bought with my stolen future. I looked at the pile of thorns on the marble counter. My mother spent her life snipping away the sharp, inconvenient edges of reality to construct a perfect, beautiful facade. To her, I was just a thorn, something to be cut off and discarded so Savannah could bloom. She did not see me as a daughter. She saw me as a resource pool, a deep well of resilience that she could endlessly pump to irrigate my sister's barren life. I did not argue with her anymore. Arguing with Vivian was like trying to punch water. It just splashed back and drowned you. I reached out and pulled the 20 pages of bank statements back off the counter. I slid them carefully into my canvas bag. "I am leaving," I said. "You are missing dinner," she replied without looking up from the roses. "Your sister made a lovely salad." "Do not be dramatic, Evelyn. We will discuss the repayment schedule when you are feeling less emotional." I turned my back on her and walked out of the kitchen. I did not slam the door. I walked back into the suffocating July heat and climbed into my truck. I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life. The dashboard clock read 5:45. As I drove away from the pristine white colonial house, the cold realization settled deep into my bones. The credit card theft was horrific, but it was only a symptom of a much older disease. My mother's casual cruelty today was not an isolated incident. It was the natural evolution of a dynamic she had established decades ago. I merged onto the highway. The tires hummed against the asphalt. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. The casual way she had said, "You are strong enough to carry this weight for her." I had heard that exact justification before. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and suddenly I was not a 26-year-old scientist driving down a coastal highway. I was 14 years old again, standing in a dusty horse barn holding a shattered wrist. The summer I turned 14, the air in the riding arena was thick with dust and the smell of sweet feed. I was training a young gelding. He spooked at a shadow cast by the afternoon sun, reared up on his hind legs, and threw me hard against the wooden perimeter fence. I landed at a terrible angle. I heard the sickening crack of my own radius bone snapping near the wrist. I sat in the dirt, cradling my arm against my chest. The pain was blinding, but I did not scream. I had learned early in our household that making noise brought irritation rather than comfort. Savannah was 12 at the time. She had been sitting on the top rail of the viewing fence, holding a soda. When the horse bolted, she lost her balance, slipped, and scraped her shin against the rough pine wood. It was a shallow scratch. It was barely enough to draw a single bead of blood. But Savannah screamed as if she had been severed in half. Vivian came running from the stables. She sprinted right past me, sitting in the dust with a fractured arm. She fell to her knees in the dirt to cradle Savannah. She rocked my crying sister back and forth, smoothing her hair and whispering frantic, soothing words to calm her fabricated agony. I stood up. My wrist was swelling fast and turning a dark, mottled purple. I walked to the tack room in silence. I found a roll of white athletic tape used for wrapping horse ankles. I clamped one end of the rough tape between my teeth and used my good hand to bind my broken wrist tight enough to stop the throbbing. When I walked back out into the sunlight, Vivian was carrying Savannah toward the car. My mother paused and looked at me standing there with my makeshift cast. Her expression held zero guilt. It held only a cold, pragmatic assessment. "You are iron, Evelyn," Vivian told me with a firm nod. "You survive everything. Savannah needs me. You do not." She put Savannah in the front seat and drove away. I walked 3 miles down the dirt road to the highway and caught a ride to the local medical clinic with a neighbor. That memory faded as I pulled my truck into the gravel parking lot of a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. I needed a neutral space to sift through the bank statements before I went back to my rented cabin. My mother's philosophy was a toxic balancing scale. My resilience was the exact trait that made my parents feel justified in exploiting me. They did not view their theft as a crime. They viewed it as a necessary wealth redistribution to keep their fragile, favored child afloat. I ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table. I spread the 20 pages of financial ruin across the worn wooden surface. I was midway through highlighting a recurring charge from a luxury boutique when the bell above the cafe door chimed. The scent of expensive floral perfume hit the air before I even looked up. Savannah walked in. She was flanked by 2 friends who looked like engineered clones of her. She wore a tailored linen blazer, oversized sunglasses, and carried a leather handbag that cost more than my first vehicle. The leather was pristine white. The hardware was heavy polished gold. I recognized the brand instantly. I also recognized the exact price tag from page 4 of my credit report. She spotted me in the corner. Instead of showing an ounce of shame, she smiled brightly and strutted over to my table. She dropped the heavy designer bag onto the chair across from me. The metallic clink of the gold hardware striking the wood was sharp and unapologetic. "Evelyn," she chimed, "Mom texted me you left the house in a mood. You really need to stop being so tense all the time. It is bad for your cortisol levels." I looked at my sister. The designer sunglasses rested on top of her perfectly styled blonde hair. She radiated an unearned arrogance. She was a parasite wearing a host's clothing. I pointed a dirt-stained finger at her white leather handbag. "That bag carries a 24% annual percentage rate, Savannah. The interest alone is compounding daily under my name." She rolled her eyes and signaled the barista for a complicated iced drink. "Do not be dramatic, Evie," she sighed. "It was a necessary business expense. I am the Chief Executive Officer of an eco-lifestyle brand now, CEO. I have to look the part when I meet with venture capitalists. You cannot launch a premium sustainability company looking like a farmhand. You should be proud of me. I am finally building my empire. You are building a house of cards, using my social security number," I stated evenly. My voice did not rise. I analyzed her posture. There was no guilt in her shoulders. Her eyes held a vacant, entitled glaze. She was perfectly comfortable cannibalizing my life because Vivian had taught her that my life was public property. "We are family," Savannah whined, crossing her arms in defensive indignation. "Mom and Dad said you had plenty of margin. You literally play in the mud for a living. What do you even need perfect credit for out in the woods? My brand is going to change the world. You are just being selfish because you do not understand visionary entrepreneurship." I stared at her. She truly believed her own delusions. She was 24 years old and still running to Vivian whenever she scraped her knee. Now she had scraped my financial future down to the bone and expected me to hand her a bandage and an apology. "Enjoy your coffee, CEO," I said softly. I gathered the bank statements and slid them back into my canvas bag. "I suggest you enjoy the handbag while you still have it." I walked out of the cafe, leaving her pouting in the center of the room. The encounter cemented my resolve. This was not a misunderstanding that could be mediated over a family dinner. This was a parasitic infection. To cure a blight, you must isolate the origin. I climbed back into my truck and opened my laptop on the center console. I tethered it to my cellular connection. Mr. Abernathy had emailed me the encrypted PDF files containing the original credit card applications. These were the digital scans of the physical paperwork submitted to the banks. I clicked open the first file. The application was for a Platinum Rewards card with a $30,000 limit. The address listed was my parents' estate. The income reported was mine. The signature at the bottom of the page was a sweeping cursive imitation of my name. It was a decent forgery, but anyone who knew me would recognize it was too fluid. My actual signature is sharp and angular, formed by hands accustomed to holding soil probes rather than calligraphy pens. But the forged signature was not the detail that made my breath catch. To open a premium credit line of this magnitude without appearing in person, the bank required a notarized identity verification form. I scrolled down to the second page of the PDF. There, in the bottom right corner, was the official seal of an Alabama notary public. It was a physical ink stamp, the brass seal pressed into the paper and coated in dark blue ink. I zoomed in on the image. My eyes traced the circular border of the official emblem. There was a distinct tiny blank sliver in the upper right quadrant of the blue circle. It was a microscopic chip in the brass die that prevented the ink from transferring flawlessly to the page. I recognized that flaw. I had seen that exact broken ink circle on my high school graduation documents. I had seen it on the title transfer when my father bought a used tractor 5 years ago. The stamp belonged to Mrs. Loretta Gable. She was the local town notary. She ran a small office behind the agricultural feed store. She was also Vivian's closest friend and regular tennis partner at the country club. My mother had not just forged my name. She had conspired with a licensed state official to legally verify a fraudulent document. They had left a permanent, traceable fingerprint right in the middle of their crime. I closed the laptop screen. A cold, predatory calm washed over me. I put the truck in gear and turned the steering wheel toward the industrial side of town. It was time to pay Mrs. Gable a visit. The drive to the industrial side of town took 20 minutes. The route took me away from the manicured lawns of my parents' subdivision and deep into the working heart of the county. The agricultural feed store sat at the end of a cracked asphalt road. It was a weathered, corrugated metal building surrounded by wooden pallets of raw fertilizer and rusted tractor implements. Tucked around the back of the main warehouse, accessible only by a gravel path choked with crabgrass, was a small, standalone trailer. A faded wooden sign above the door read, "Loretta Gable Tax Preparation and Notary Public." I parked my truck in the gravel. The afternoon sun beat down on the metal roof of the trailer, creating shimmering waves of heat distortion in the air. I walked up the 3 wooden steps and pushed the door open. It stuck on its hinges, groaning loudly in protest. The air inside the small office was stifling. A cheap window conditioning unit rattled relentlessly in the thin frame. It sputtered out lukewarm air that smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and ancient paper. Stacks of manila folders leaned dangerously against the faux wood-paneled walls. Mrs. Gable sat behind a chipped laminate desk. She was fanning her flushed face with a piece of junk mail. Her reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She looked up. Her expression shifted from bored fatigue to forced neighborly cheer the moment she recognized me. "Evelyn Hathaway," she beamed, setting the mail down. "What brings you to this dusty corner of the world? I have not seen you since the country club bake sale last spring. How is your mother doing?" I did not smile. I did not return the pleasantry. I walked to the edge of the laminate desk. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the printed copy of the Platinum credit card application. I placed it face up on the desk directly in front of her. "We need to talk about your official state seal, Mrs. Gable," I said. My voice was calm-pitched, just above the loud, rhythmic rattling of the window unit. She put her reading glasses on. She leaned forward and squinted at the document. The cheerful, neighborly facade drained from her face the second she recognized the paperwork. The color left her cheeks, leaving her skin a pale, sickly gray. She looked up at me. Her hands began to tremble. "Evelyn," she stammered, "I do not understand. Vivian told me this was all handled." "Vivian lied," I replied softly. I pointed my dirt-stained index finger at the bottom right corner of the page. I tapped the blue ink circle containing her official registration number. "You are a commissioned officer of the state of Alabama," I said. "Your signature and your seal are legal guarantees of identity. You verified that I stood in this room, presented a government-issued identification card, and signed this financial instrument in your presence." I was 200 miles away, standing in a testing field the day this document was stamped. Mrs. Gable swallowed hard. A bead of sweat broke out on her upper lip. The rattling of the air conditioner suddenly sounded like a countdown clock. "Your mother brought the paperwork in," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She said it was just a formality, a family favor to help Savannah get a business lease. She said you were too busy playing in the dirt up north to drive down here and sign it yourself. Vivian is a good Christian woman, Evelyn. She serves on the charity board with me. I had no reason to doubt her. She signed your name right here on my desk. I just applied the stamp to help her out." I stared at her. The sheer entitlement of their social circle was staggering. They believed the law was something that applied to other people, while they were protected by country club memberships and charity luncheons. A family favor does not override the Alabama Criminal Code, I stated. I kept my posture rigid. I did not raise my voice or lean over her desk. The cold delivery of facts was far more effective than shouting. Under Alabama law, fraudulent notarization of a financial instrument is a felony. It is punishable by up to 10 years in a state penitentiary. It carries mandatory restitution. You will lose your state commission. You will lose your pension. You will likely lose this business. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with her trembling hands. A quiet sob escaped her throat. She was not a hardened criminal. She was just a careless woman who valued social currency more than her legal duty. Now the bill for that carelessness was due. "Please, Evelyn," she cried, "do not go to the police. I will do whatever you want. I will revoke the stamp. I will write a letter to the bank. Please do not take my livelihood away over a mistake." I did not offer her comfort. I did not tell her it would be fine. "Open your bottom drawer, Mrs. Gable," I said. She blinked through her tears. She fumbled with a set of keys on her desk. Ring unlocked the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet and pulled out a heavy black leather-bound book. It was her official notary ledger. State law required her to record every single act she performed. I took the heavy book from her hands. I opened it and flipped toward the dates from April. There, recorded in black ink, were 6 separate applications under my name. In the column designated for the signer's signature, Vivian had brazenly forged my name in front of a state official. I tore the 3 pages out of the ledger. Mrs. Gable gasped, but did not stop me. Next, I noticed a stack of manila folders in the open drawer. One of them had the name Hathaway written on the tab. I reached down and pulled it out. Inside were the original wet ink copies of the credit applications. Vivian had requested extra physical copies for her own records and left them here for safekeeping. I folded them and slid them into my canvas bag alongside the ledger pages. Then my eyes caught something else. Sitting next to her keyboard was the physical brass stamp itself. It was an old-fashioned model. It had a heavy, polished wooden handle and a solid brass die base. I picked it up. The metal felt heavy and cold in my palm. I turned it over to examine the raised brass lettering that created the seal. There, on the outer rim of the circular brass border, was a tiny microscopic chip. It was a physical defect in the metal. I reached across her desk and took a blank sheet of printer paper from her tray. I pressed the heavy brass die firmly into her blue ink pad. Then I pressed the stamp down hard onto the crisp white paper. I lifted the wooden handle. The blue seal was stamped onto the paper. It was a perfect circle, except for one distinct blank sliver in the upper right quadrant. The chipped brass failed to transfer ink to that exact fraction of a millimeter. It was a mechanical fingerprint. It was a unique, unalterable flaw that proved exactly which tool had been used to authorize the fraud. I folded that piece of paper and put it in my pocket. I set the heavy brass stamp back down on the laminate desk. I have the ledger pages, I have the original forged applications, and I have the proof of your specific seal, I told her. You are going to sit in this sweltering office, and you are going to wait. When I decide how to handle my mother, I will decide how to handle you. Until then, you do not call Vivian. You do not warn her. If she finds out I was here, I will hand these pages directly to the district attorney. Mrs. Gable nodded frantically. Tears streamed down her flushed face, ruining her makeup. She was entirely broken, trapped by her own willingness to bend the rules for a friend. I turned and walked out of the office. The door groaned on its hinges again as it shut behind me. The heat of the late afternoon hit me like a physical wall as I stepped off the wooden stairs. I walked across the gravel toward my truck. I had secured the physical evidence. I had the forged signatures and the flawed stamp. The timeline was coming together perfectly. I unlocked the truck door and climbed inside. Before I could even put the key in the ignition, my cell phone began to vibrate in the center console. It buzzed once, then twice. Then it erupted into a continuous, rhythmic shaking. I picked up the phone. The notification screen was flooded. I had 14 new text messages, 3 missed calls, and 2 new voicemails. They were not from my mother or my sister. They were from people in my professional and social circles. I tapped the screen and opened the first message. It was from Silas, the primary seed supplier I had worked with for 3 years. "Evelyn," the text read, "just heard the news from your mom. I am so sorry you are struggling. We can set up a payment plan for your next seed delivery if you need it. Gambling is a tough disease to beat. Praying for you." I frowned. I swiped to the next message. It was from the head of the local agricultural board. "Evelyn, please call me. Vivian reached out. She is heartbroken. Extorting your parents to cover your secret debts is not the answer. Let us get you some professional help." I scrolled through the rest. Message after message echoed the exact same narrative. Secret debts, gambling addiction, extortion. A broken-hearted mother just trying to save her troubled daughter. Vivian had not waited to see what I would do. The moment I walked out of her kitchen, she realized she had lost control of the narrative. To a woman like my mother, losing control was worse than dying. So she had launched a preemptive strike. She was burning the forest to hide the tree. She was poisoning the entire town against me, seeding a vicious smear campaign designed to destroy my credibility. If I went public with the fraud now, the community would just view it as the desperate lies of an addicted daughter trying to ruin her generous parents. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not feel the urge to draft frantic defensive replies. I did not call Silas to explain. You cannot argue with a whisper campaign. The more you shout, the guiltier you look. Instead, I took a screenshot of every single message. I archived the voicemails. I methodically saved every piece of defamation. Vivian thought she was burying me under a mountain of lies. She did not realize she was just handing me more paperwork to use at the final table. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the gravel lot. It was time to take the credit statements to a professional. I needed a forensic accountant to trace exactly how my stolen future had been spent. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows across the asphalt as I pulled into the gravel lot behind the main agricultural supply depot on the edge of the county line. I needed 50 pounds of specialized nitrogen fertilizer for my control group in the northern field. It was a mundane task. Routine was the anchor that kept my mind sharp. I parked my truck near the loading dock. The depot was a sprawling warehouse constructed of corrugated steel, smelling richly of alfalfa-dried corn and pesticide. Usually, walking into this building felt like walking into a second home. The local farmers and crop managers knew me by name. They frequently asked for my advice on soil rotation and pH amendments. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The familiar brass bell jingled loudly, announcing my arrival. Then, the noise stopped. The low hum of conversation that always filled the front counter area died instantly. 3 men, wearing worn denim and work boots, stood near the seed display. They looked at me, then immediately shifted their gaze down to the linoleum floor. One of them muttered something under his breath and walked quickly down the fertilizer aisle. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. The air felt thick, entirely devoid of the usual Southern hospitality. I walked up to the counter. The cashier, a woman named Shirley, who had asked about my research farm just last Tuesday, stood stiffly behind the register. She did not offer her usual warm greeting. She refused to meet my eyes, focusing intently on scanning a barcode on a pair of leather work gloves for another customer. "I need 2 bags of the synthetic nitrogen mix," I said. My voice was level. It echoed slightly in the unnatural quiet of the store. Shirley tapped the screen of her register. She did not look up. "Aisle 4, she said curtly. "Bring the tag to the front." I walked down the aisle. I felt the weight of their shifting eyes pressing into my back. A whisper in the South is louder than a siren. Vivian had not just planted a seed, she had scorched the earth. She had weaponized her pristine reputation in the community to paint me as a degenerate, a gambling addict, an extortionist. By the time I carried the heavy tags back to the front, the other customers had conveniently found reasons to exit the building. I handed Shirley 2 crisp $50 bills. She handed me my change without a word, her lips pressed into a thin, judging line. "Thank you, Shirley," I said. She gave a short, rigid nod. I turned and walked out, letting the glass door shut behind me. I loaded the heavy bags into the bed of my truck. The physical exertion was grounding. I did not feel humiliated by their silence. I felt a cold, clinical understanding of my mother's strategy. Vivian was a master of social warfare. She had chaired the Historical Society and run the hospital charity gala for a decade. She understood that people prefer a comfortable lie over an ugly truth. The idea of a wealthy, pious mother dealing with a troubled, addicted daughter was a familiar narrative. It garnered sympathy. The idea of a mother committing federal wire fraud to fund her youngest child's designer lifestyle was grotesque. I drove back to my rented cabin in the woods. The structure was small, built of rough-hewn cedar, surrounded by towering pine trees. It was quiet. It was mine. I sat at my small wooden kitchen table and placed my phone in the center of the wood grain. The screen was still lighting up with notifications. I poured myself a glass of cold water and systematically opened the voicemail application. I needed to hear exactly what story Vivian was spinning. I pressed play on the first message. It was my Aunt Patricia. Her voice dripped with practiced, honeyed concern. "Evelyn, honey, your mother called me in tears. We know about the casinos over in Biloxi. There is no shame in having a sickness, but threatening your own parents with lawsuits to cover your debts is just wicked. You need Jesus and a 12-step meeting, not to break your mother's heart. Call me when you are ready to repent." I deleted the message from my inbox, but only after forwarding the audio file to a secure cloud drive. I played the next one. It was Reverend Miller from my parents' congregation. "Evelyn, pride goes before the fall. Your father is beside himself. We are ready to help you find a rehabilitation center. Please stop this extortion attempt before you do permanent damage to your soul." Message after message played. They were variations of the same theme. I was a secret addict. I had ruined my own credit. I was trying to blackmail my generous, loving parents into bailing me out. Vivian had tailored the lie perfectly to fit my solitary nature. Because I spent weeks alone in the field, isolated from the social scene, it was easy for her to fill that void with fabricated vices. Nobody knew what I did out in the woods, so Vivian simply invented a gambling habit to explain the $87,000. The old version of me might have scrambled to defend herself. I might have called Aunt Patricia and begged her to look at the forged notary stamps. I might have posted the truth on social media, screaming into the void for justice. But the stoic professional sitting at the cedar table knew better. When your opponent is digging a hole, you do not take the shovel from their hands. You hand them a bigger shovel. Every single condescending voicemail, every text message accusing me of extortion was another brick in the fortress of evidence I was building. I created a digital folder on my laptop. I named it Defamation. I meticulously archived every audio file, every screenshot, and every email. I saved the timestamps. I saved the contact information. Vivian thought she was silencing me through public shaming. She did not realize she was documenting her own obstruction of justice. I closed the laptop and watched the sun dip below the tree line outside my kitchen window. The local police department would be useless now. Vivian played golf with the chief of police. If I walked into the station with my credit reports, it would be my word against the most powerful socialite in Mobile. I needed undeniable complex financial mapping. I needed an expert who did not care about charity galas or country club gossip. I needed a forensic accountant. The next morning, I woke before dawn. I dressed in a clean-pressed shirt and a pair of dark slacks. I packed the canvas bag with the forged credit applications, the torn notary ledger pages, the bank statements, and the physical printout of the flawed ink stamp. I drove an hour out of the county to a sleek, modern office park in the financial district of the city. The building was a tower of glass and steel. It held no Southern charm. It was a monument to raw, unforgiving mathematics. I rode the elevator to the 14th floor and walked through a set of frosted glass doors. The reception area was minimalist and quiet. I had an 8 o'clock appointment with Felix Thorne. His firm specialized in tracking hidden assets and corporate embezzlement. A young assistant led me down a carpeted hallway and opened the door to a spacious corner office. Felix Thorne sat behind a massive glass desk. He wore a sharp navy suit. His eyes were focused, framed by wire-rimmed glasses. He did not ask about my family or offer me sweet tea. He pointed to a leather chair opposite his desk. "Ms. Hathaway," he said, crisp and professional, "you mentioned on the phone that you have a case of systemic identity theft involving a state official." I sat down. I opened my canvas bag and withdrew the stack of documents. I placed them on the glass desk. "My parents opened 6 lines of credit in my name," I explained. "They utilized a local notary to forge the identity verifications. They racked up $87,000 in debt over 90 days. The billing statements list luxury travel, high-end electronics, and boutique clothing. I need you to trace every single transaction. I need a legally bulletproof ledger showing exactly where the money went and who authorized the payments." Felix nodded. He reached for the top page of the credit report. He pulled a yellow highlighter from his pen cup. "Let us see how careless they were," he murmured. He began to scan the itemized statements. For 5 minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft rustle of paper and the occasional squeak of the highlighter tip against the page. I sat perfectly still, waiting for him to confirm what I already knew. Savannah's designer lifestyle was written in those margins. Then Felix stopped. His hand hovered over a charge on the 3rd page. He frowned, pushing his glasses further up the bridge of his nose. He flipped to the 5th page, cross-referencing a date. He moved to the final page and traced a line of text with his finger. "Ms. Hathaway," he said. His voice had lost its detached professional cadence. It was suddenly sharp, urgent. I leaned forward. "Have you found the boutique purchases?" He looked up from the paper. He stared at me with an expression of grim realization. "I found the boutiques," he replied, "but the designer clothes and the plane tickets only account for about $14,000 of this debt. They were smaller, everyday purchases to keep up appearances." I furrowed my brow. "Then where did the other $73,000 go?" Felix turned the page around and slid it across the glass desk toward me. He tapped the yellow highlighted line with the end of his pen. "The remaining balance was not spent on luxury goods, Ms. Hathaway. It was paid in 4 large installments to a corporate law firm based in Atlanta, a firm that specializes exclusively in intellectual property and patent acquisition." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. My breath caught in my throat. "Why would my mother hire a patent attorney?" I asked. Felix looked at me. His eyes held a mixture of pity and professional dread. "They did not just steal your credit score, Ms. Hathaway," he said quietly. "They used your money to hire lawyers to steal your research." I sat frozen in the leather guest chair. The quiet hum of the climate control system seemed to amplify in the silence of the room. Felix Thorne kept his gaze steady. He did not offer empty platitudes or expressions of sympathy. He simply rotated the printed paper so the highlighted columns faced me directly. 4 distinct payments were listed in sequential order: April 12th, May 1st, May 18th, June 2nd. Each charge was exactly $19,500. The vendor receiving the funds was listed as Montgomery and Pierce. "They are not a criminal defense firm," Felix said. "They do not handle family law or basic business incorporation. They are an elite-tier intellectual property firm. They specialize in expedited patent acquisition and corporate asset shielding." I stared at the yellow ink on the page. The $87,000 had felt like a suffocating weight when I thought it was spent on designer luggage and Italian vacations. But this reality was infinitely worse. Luxury goods were just frivolous vanity. This was a calculated assassination of my professional existence. Felix uncapped his marker. The sharp squeak of the yellow highlighter echoed in the pristine office. He drew a bright fluorescent line connecting a secondary charge from the third page directly to a printed public records document he had pulled from a federal database. This charge, right here, Felix pointed. It was processed on May 14th. It matches the exact standard fee required by the United States Patent and Trademark Office for an expedited corporate filing. The applicant is an entity registered as Verdant Future Holdings. The sole managing director is listed as Savannah Hathaway. Verdant Future Holdings. That was Savannah's supposed sustainable lifestyle brand. My mother had framed it as a cute, eco-friendly startup selling branded tote bags and organic lip balm. It was a hollow shell. It was a Trojan horse wrapped in marketing buzzwords designed to carry my stolen genius across the finish line while I was out in the fields. I closed my eyes. The reality of their theft washed over me in cold, unforgiving waves. For 6 grueling years, I had dedicated every waking hour to soil pathology. I spent endless summers kneeling in the scorching Alabama dirt. My hands were permanently cracked and blistered from testing pH balances and crossbreeding resilient plant strains. I had successfully engineered a proprietary seed coating formula. It utilized a unique protein structure that allowed agricultural crops to retain deep moisture during severe, prolonged droughts. It was not a minor scientific achievement. It was a formula capable of stabilizing fragile global supply chains. It was my brainchild. It was the only thing I truly owned. Savannah could not pass a remedial biology exam. She did not know the molecular difference between nitrogen and a nematode. Yet, according to the federal government, she was the visionary inventor of the decade. I opened my eyes and looked at the forensic accountant. Why did they use my credit to pay the lawyers, I asked. My parents are wealthy. They have liquid assets. Why leave a paper trail tied to my name? Felix folded his hands on the glass desk. Because they needed a sterile financial vehicle, he explained softly. If your parents wired $80,000 to a patent attorney from their joint checking account, the transaction would be permanently tied to their names. It would create a glaring vulnerability if the patent origin was ever audited. By opening lines of credit using your pristine financial history, they effectively created a burner account. It insulated them. He tapped his pen against the desk. Furthermore, if anyone ever questioned how a 24-year-old influencer suddenly afforded elite corporate attorneys, the paper trail would show that her brilliant older sister funded the endeavor. They turned you into their unwitting silent investor. The breath left my lungs. Vivian and Winston had not just stolen my identity to pamper their golden child. They had executed a sophisticated corporate heist while I was isolated in a testing field without cellular service. They smiled at me over Sunday dinners, pouring sweet tea, knowing they had already stripped away the cornerstone of my entire career. They believed my resilience was so infinite that I would simply absorb the loss, dust off my knees, and invent something new. I reached out and touched the highlighted paper. The shock began to recede. It was rapidly replaced by a crystalline tactical focus. This was no longer a civil dispute over a damaged credit score. This was an 8-figure intellectual property theft. We need to stop the patent approval, I said. My voice was low and steady. If they are still in the filing process, we can file an injunction. We can prove the intellectual property belongs to my lab. I have years of dated research logs and digital timestamps. Felix turned toward his computer monitors. The glow of the screens reflected on the polished glass surface of his desk. He began typing rapidly. The rhythmic clacking of the keys felt like a ticking clock in the quiet office. Corporate law moves slowly, Ms. Hathaway Felix warned. But elite firms like Montgomery and Pierce are paid exorbitant fees specifically to bypass the usual bureaucratic delays. They utilize provisional applications and aggressive legal maneuvering to lock down assets fast. Let us see exactly how far along Verdant Future Holdings actually is. He navigated through a series of financial news databases and corporate registry portals. I watched his eyes scan the digital text. The professional detachment on his face faltered for a second time. His jaw tightened. He reached out and turned the primary monitor so it faced me directly. "I do not think filing a standard injunction is going to be fast enough, Evelyn," he said grimly. Displayed on the screen was a pristine digital press release. It was published on a major agricultural technology news aggregate just 4 hours ago. The headline featured a high-resolution photograph of Savannah. She was standing in a pristine, sterile laboratory she had never worked in. She was wearing a tailored white coat, holding a glass beaker and smiling her perfect engineered smile. The text below the photograph delivered the final, devastating blow. Verdant Future Holdings, the visionary eco-startup founded by Savannah Hathaway, has entered the final stages of acquisition. A global agricultural conglomerate is set to purchase the company and its groundbreaking drought-resistant seed patent. I stared at the numbers in the article. The corporate buyout was not a vague future goal. It was a finalized agreement. "The deal is scheduled to close in exactly 14 days. Felix read aloud, tracing the text with his pen. "The acquisition price is $15 million. 14 days. In 2 weeks, my sister would cash a check for $15 million. If that contract was signed, my life's work would be permanently swallowed by a faceless global corporation. The conglomerate would deploy an army of corporate litigators to protect their new asset. I would be locked out of my own industry, legally barred from ever utilizing the science I had built with my own bleeding hands." Felix pushed a glossy regional business magazine across the glass desk. It had arrived in the morning mail. The cover featured a high-resolution photograph of Savannah. I stared at the coated paper. My sister was wearing a tailored white lab coat. It was pristine. It had never seen a field, never been stained by Alabama red clay, never absorbed the sweat of a 14-hour workday under the July sun. She held a glass beaker filled with clear water, smiling her practiced, engineered smile. The headline below her perfect face read, "The future of sustainable agriculture is female." My hands rested on the arms of the leather chair. The knuckles were permanently scarred from a soil auger snapping back during a winter freeze 3 years ago. The calluses on my palms were thick and yellowed. I had spent my entire adult life cultivating the science that Savannah was now wearing like a seasonal fashion accessory. Vivian and Winston had watched me bleed for this. They had watched me miss Thanksgiving dinners because a crop trial required monitoring. They watched me isolate myself in the woods to perfect the drought-resistant protein. They knew the exact cost of the formula, and they had decided my life was merely the raw material required to manufacture Savannah's success. $15 million. The number sat heavy in the freezing air of the office. It was not just a sum of money. It was an imperial decree. It was the kind of wealth that alters reality. If that acquisition closed in 14 days, the global agricultural conglomerate would absorb my formula into their impenetrable corporate structure. They would deploy a legion of defense attorneys to bury any competing claims. "We need to file a police report immediately," Felix stated. He reached for his desk phone. "We have the forged notary seal. We have the credit card ledger. If we get a detective to open a federal wire fraud case today, we might be able to freeze the acquisition." I shook my head. I did not raise my voice. I kept my breathing steady. "Put the phone down, Felix," I said. He paused. His hand hovered over the receiver. "Evelyn, this is a multi-million-dollar corporate theft. You cannot handle this internally." I looked at the glowing monitor. I analyzed the timeline. The justice system is a slow-moving behemoth. It requires subpoenas, grand jury hearings, and endless bureaucratic delays. If I walk into a police precinct today, a detective will take my statement and place it at the bottom of a stack of pending investigations. In 14 days, Savannah will sign the final transfer agreement. Once the conglomerate legally assumes ownership of the intellectual property, they will view me as a hostile external threat. They will utilize their limitless capital to drag a civil suit out for a decade until I am bankrupt and broken. I cannot fight a global corporation, Felix, I explained quietly. I do not have the funds to wage a 10-year war against their legal department. By the time a detective secures a warrant, my formula will already be locked inside a corporate vault. The police are a shield. I do not need a shield right now. Felix withdrew his hand from the phone. He leaned back in his chair. He recognized the cold, tactical shift in my demeanor. He was an accountant. He understood risk assessment. Then how do you stop a $15 million acquisition in 2 weeks? He asked. You do not stop the acquisition, I replied. You let the greed do the work. I instructed Felix to finalize the forensic audit. I needed a certified, unassailable ledger documenting every single fraudulent transaction. I needed the direct financial link between the platinum credit cards and the elite patent attorneys in Atlanta, bound in a formal investigative report. I told him I would return for the physical binder in 48 hours. Felix agreed. He promised to prioritize the file. I thanked him, gathered my canvas bag, and stood up. I left the magazine with Savannah's pristine lab coat sitting on his desk. It was an illusion. Illusions shatter when you apply enough pressure. I walked out of the frosted glass doors and took the elevator down to the ground floor. The transition from the freezing corporate tower to the oppressive Alabama heat was jarring. The air in the parking garage was thick with humidity and the smell of hot asphalt. I walked down the concrete row toward my dusty work truck. My mind was already structuring a new sequence of events. Vivian had launched a whisper campaign to ruin my credibility. Savannah was playing the visionary entrepreneur for the media. But there was a third architect to this betrayal. I rounded a concrete pillar and stopped. Parked directly next to my 10-year-old truck was a sleek, black luxury sedan. The engine was off, but the windows were tinted dark. Leaning casually against the hood of the expensive vehicle was a man in a tailored charcoal suit. It was Winston Hathaway, my father. He was checking his heavy gold wristwatch. He looked up as my boots crunched against the loose gravel on the concrete floor. His face was a stoic mask. Winston ran a regional logistics empire. He was a man who viewed human beings as line items on a spreadsheet. He did not possess Vivian's theatrical cruelty or Savannah's hollow vanity. He operated on a terrifying level of pure calculated efficiency. Evelyn, he said. His voice echoed slightly in the empty parking garage. It was calm and authoritative. I stopped 10 feet away from him. I did not grip the strap of my canvas bag. I let my arms hang loose at my sides. You followed me, I stated. He slipped his phone into his suit pocket. Your mother told me you visited the bank yesterday. She mentioned you were upset about the credit accounts. I tracked the GPS beacon on your truck. I figured you would come to the financial district to find an auditor. You always were thorough. It is one of your best qualities. He spoke as if he were conducting a routine performance review. There was no guilt in his posture. He stood tall, projecting the quiet dominance that had made him a millionaire 3 times over. You helped Vivian steal my patent, I said. My voice matched his clinical tone. Winston sighed. He pushed away from the hood of the sedan and took a slow step toward me. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly tired of having to explain basic economics to a subordinate. Steal is a dramatic word, Evelyn. We reallocated a family asset. We placed it where it would generate the highest yield for the collective future of this family. I stared at the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle, the man who had paid for my first microscope. The depth of the betrayal settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. He was not here to apologize. He was here to negotiate a surrender. Reallocated a family asset. I repeated the phrase. The syllables felt heavy and metallic on my tongue. You are talking about 6 years of my life, Winston. I mapped the genome of that seed. I spent thousands of hours analyzing soil pathology while Savannah was failing out of liberal arts programs. That formula is not a family asset. It is my property. Winston shook his head. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit. You are looking at this through a highly emotional lens, Evelyn. You need to zoom out and look at the macro view. This family is an enterprise. We have a collective reputation, a collective wealth, and a collective future. Right now, that enterprise is unbalanced. He took a slow step forward. His leather wingtip shoes crunched softly against the grit on the concrete floor. You are a natural success, he continued. His tone was infuriatingly reasonable. You have grit. You have discipline. If I stripped you of every dollar you own and dropped you in the middle of a desert, you would find water and build a functioning well by Tuesday. You do not need our help to survive. Savannah does. I stared at him. The heat of the garage pressed against my skin, but my blood ran cold. He was summarizing my resilience as if it were a penalty. Savannah is fragile, Winston stated. He said it without malice, merely reporting a fact. She lacks your constitution. If she does not secure a permanent high-status position soon, she will be a lifelong dependent. She will drain our resources and tarnish the family name with her failures. The patent solves that problem. It gives her a legitimate empire. It gives her wealth, status, and independence. It fixes the deficit. So you stole my intellect to cover her deficit, I said. You crippled your capable daughter to prop up the failing one. He frowned slightly, displeased with my terminology. I did not cripple you. I merely took one project. You will invent something else, Evelyn. You always do. Your mind is a factory. Savannah just needed the product off the assembly line to secure her future. We balanced the scales. It was the only logical equation. The sheer sociopathic clarity of his math left me breathless. He did not feel an ounce of remorse. He truly believed his logic was sound. He viewed my genius as a renewable resource that could be harvested at will to subsidize Savannah's ineptitude. And the $87,000 in credit card debt, I asked? Why use my name to hire the patent attorneys? You have millions in liquid capital. If you were going to steal my work, why not pay for the lawyers yourself? Winston sighed. He lifted his left arm and casually checked his heavy gold wristwatch. The metallic gleam caught the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage overhead. It was a subtle, deliberate gesture. He was signaling that my devastation was merely a brief inconvenience to his afternoon schedule. He had a board meeting to attend. My ruined life was just an item on his daily agenda. We needed clean funds, he explained, dropping his arm. If Vivian or I wired a patent attorney $20,000 a month, it would trigger internal banking flags. It would establish a direct financial link between us and Verdant Future Holdings. If the patent origin was ever scrutinized during corporate due diligence, our names on the legal invoices would raise alarming questions. He smoothed his silk tie. By utilizing your credit history, we bypassed the risk. The paper trail shows that Savannah's own sister funded her startup. It creates a beautiful, plausible narrative of sibling support. It insulates the intellectual property from any claims of parental interference. It was a necessary structural decision. I looked into his eyes. I searched for a flicker of shame, a hint of paternal guilt, a shadow of the man who used to read me bedtime stories. There was nothing there. The void was terrifying. He was not a father standing in a parking garage. He was a chief executive officer who had just successfully liquidated a hostile asset. You destroyed my credit score to build a firewall, I said. My voice was a flat, dead calm. You committed federal wire fraud. You bribed a state notary. You stole a multi-million-dollar scientific breakthrough. You did all of this to hand a spoiled child a $15 million golden ticket. Winston narrowed his eyes. He did not like the word fraud. We did what was required to protect the enterprise, he countered smoothly, and you are going to accept it. You are going to sign a retroactive debt assumption agreement. We will quietly funnel you the cash to pay off the credit cards over the next 5 years. You get your clean credit back, Savannah gets her buyout, and everyone walks away intact. I felt a cold smile pull at the corners of my mouth. It was not a happy expression. It was the physical manifestation of a bridge burning. I am not signing anything, Winston. I am going to let this entire fraudulent empire burn to the ground. I am going to prove the intellectual property belongs to my lab, and I am going to watch Savannah try to explain soil pathology to a federal judge. The polite corporate mask finally slipped from his face. The air between us grew rigid. His jaw tightened. The veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. Do not let your pride make you stupid, Evelyn, he warned. His voice dropped an octave, turning dark and menacing. You are a scientist. You do not understand the legal machinery I can deploy. If you try to interfere with this corporate acquisition, I will bury you. I will tie you up in litigation until you are 50 years old. I will ensure you never work in a commercial agricultural laboratory again. Go back to your cabin, dig in your dirt, leave Savannah's deal alone. He turned around, walked to his luxury sedan, and opened the door. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. Consider your next move very carefully, he said. Family helps family. If you choose not to be family, you become an obstacle. I remove obstacles. He slid into the driver's seat. The engine purred to life. The dark-tinted windows rolled up, sealing him inside his pristine bubble. I watched the black car pull out of the garage and merge into the bright, blinding sunlight of the street. I stood alone in the concrete shadows. The threat was not an empty promise. Winston Hathaway wielded wealth like a bludgeon. He had unlimited resources. I had a dusty truck, a rented cabin, and 20 pages of bank statements. He believed he had already won. He believed I would cower under the sheer weight of his capital and retreat into the woods. He was wrong. I did not feel fear. I felt the profound, liberating clarity that comes when you realize there is nothing left to save. The social contract was broken. I no longer had parents. I had adversaries. I walked to my truck, climbed inside, and drove the hour-long route back to my cabin. The evening descended, casting long, dark shadows through the dense pine trees. I sat at my wooden kitchen table for hours. I did not turn on the television. I did not eat. I stared at the grain of the wood and ran the variables through my mind. The next morning arrived with a thick, humid fog rolling off the nearby lake. The air was heavy and still. I was standing in my small kitchen brewing a pot of dark roast coffee when I heard the sharp, authoritative crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. I looked through the window above the sink. A plain white sedan was parked behind my truck. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped out. He carried a thick manila envelope tucked tightly under his arm. He did not look like a lost tourist. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the perimeter of my isolated property. I set my coffee mug on the counter. I walked to the front door and opened it before he could knock. "Evelyn Hathaway," the man asked. His tone was bored, routine. "Yes," I answered. He held out the thick manila envelope. "You have been served," he stated. He turned around and walked back to his vehicle without another word. The engine started, the tires crunched the gravel, and he disappeared into the morning fog. I stood on the wooden porch. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. It was heavy. The return address printed in the upper left corner belonged to a prestigious corporate law firm in Mobile. It was not the firm Savannah was using for her patent. It was Winston's personal legal team. I broke the seal and pulled out the stack of dense legal paper. The heading on the first page was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. It was a formal cease and desist declaration. I flipped through the pages. The document accused me of malicious defamation, tortious interference with prospective business relations, and targeted harassment against Verdant Future Holdings. They were not waiting for me to attack. They were using the law as a preemptive weapon to crush me before I could even speak. I walked back inside my rented cabin and shut the front door against the morning fog. The damp chill of the Alabama air clung to my clothes, but the cold radiating from the manila envelope in my hands felt much deeper. I walked into the small kitchen and sat down at the rough-hewn cedar table. My mug of dark roast coffee sat untouched, a thin wisp of steam rising from the dark surface. I set the envelope down and slid the thick stack of legal paper out. The tactile sensation of the documents was striking. This was not standard printer paper. It was heavy textured ivory cardstock. It carried a distinct raised watermark from a prestigious corporate law firm located in the most expensive commercial high-rise in Mobile. The crisp pages felt weighty and substantial. They represented the crushing financial power of my family. They were a physical manifestation of a betrayal funded by my own stolen credit. I smoothed the first page flat against the wood grain and began to read. I did not skim the text. I read every single line with the exact methodical focus I used when analyzing microscopic soil samples. The document was a masterpiece of institutionalized gaslighting. The legal framing was breathtaking in its audacity. The first section formally accused me of executing a targeted campaign of defamation against Verdant Future Holdings and its founder, Savannah Hathaway. The lawyers claimed I was a disgruntled relative suffering from severe financial distress, motivated by deep-seated jealousy. They cited my recent visit to the local agricultural feed store as evidence of my erratic public behavior, twisting the silent judgment of the town into proof of my own instability. Vivian's Whisper campaign had not just been petty social sabotage. It had been a calculated preliminary strike designed to establish a documented history of my supposed mental decline. She had planted the seeds of my ruin, and now Winston's lawyers were harvesting the crop. I turned to the second page. The legal intimidation intensified. The firm threatened to file a devastating civil lawsuit against me if I attempted to contact the global agricultural conglomerate currently negotiating the acquisition of Savannah's company. The letter stated that any interference with the impending $15 million transaction would be classified as tortious interference with prospective business relations. They warned that if I spoke to the corporate buyers, they would sue me for millions in damages. They threatened to garnish my future wages, place a lien on my dusty work truck, and ensure I never secured employment in the agronomy sector ever again. I traced the heavy black ink of the signature block. The lead partner of the firm had signed it. Winston had spared no expense. He had hired a ruthless legal mercenary to terrify me into submission. A sudden, sharp wave of profound injustice washed over me. It was a suffocating, infuriating sensation. They had stolen my identity. They had drained my flawless credit score. They had bribed a state official to forge my signature. They had stolen 6 years of my agonizing agricultural research. And now, sitting in their immaculate white-pillared colonial estate, they were using the justice system as a shield to protect their crimes, while accusing me of the exact sabotage they had committed. A law is supposed to be a mechanism for truth. In the hands of Winston Hathaway, the law was just another blunt instrument used to bludgeon a perceived threat into compliance. I leaned back in my wooden chair. The old version of me, the daughter who still craved a microscopic ounce of parental validation, might have panicked. A normal person receiving a threat of ruinous litigation from a team of corporate sharks would scramble for the phone. They would call the law firm, sobbing, begging for mercy, promising to stay quiet just to avoid the crushing weight of a lawsuit. Winston was counting on that panic. He was a logistics baron. I grew up watching him destroy rival trucking companies using this exact strategy. He would bury small, independent competitors under avalanches of aggressive legal paperwork until they simply ran out of funds and surrendered their roots. He viewed human endurance as a finite resource that could be depleted through strategic pressure. He assumed I would fold because I was a scientist, not a litigator. But my father misunderstood the core nature of my profession. I am a soil agronomist. My entire existence revolves around studying complex ecosystems, identifying invasive threats, and neutralizing them. When a parasitic organism invades a crop, inexperienced farmers panic. They spray the surface of the plants with harsh chemicals, hoping to kill the threat by brute force. That method almost always fails. It damages the host plant, and the parasite simply burrows deeper into the root system to survive. You do not fight a deeply entrenched parasite with a surface attack. You alter the internal chemistry of the host. You introduce a systemic compound into the sap of the plant. The parasite drinks the altered sap willingly, believing it is consuming pure nourishment. You let the invasive creature gorge itself on its own greed. You let it consume the poison voluntarily until it bursts from the inside out. Winston and Vivian were parasites. They had latched onto my credit, my intellect, and my future. They were currently gorging themselves on the prospect of a $15 million corporate buyout. They were so close to their ultimate victory that they could taste the money. I looked back down at the final page of the cease and desist packet. It contained a specific demand. The lawyers had included a pre-drafted non-disclosure and relinquishment of rights agreement. The instructions were rigid. I was commanded to sign the document within 48 hours. By signing, I would legally acknowledge that Savannah was the sole, unassisted inventor of the drought-resistant seed formula. I would waive any and all future claims against Verdant Future Holdings. If I provided my signature, Winston promised to drop the defamation lawsuit and quietly pay off the $87,000 in credit card debt over a 5-year period. I stared at the dotted line awaiting my name. The sheer arrogance of the demand was revealing. Winston did not just want me to stay quiet, he needed my signature. The global agricultural conglomerate was likely conducting their final due diligence before wiring $15 million. Corporate buyers are notoriously paranoid about intellectual property disputes. If there was even a shadow of a rumor that Savannah did not own the formula free and clear, the conglomerate would freeze the acquisition immediately. Winston needed a clean, legally binding surrender from me to guarantee the deal closed without a single cloud on the title. He was desperate for my compliance. He was using the threat of a lawsuit to force my hand, but his demand exposed his greatest vulnerability. He needed a contract. They wanted me to sign a document that handed them my life. They expected me to capitulate under the pressure of their legal bludgeon. They assumed they were dictating the terms of my surrender. I reached across the table and pushed my cold mug of coffee aside. The lingering fog outside my window began to burn off under the rising Alabama sun. The shadows in my kitchen receded. My mind shifted into a realm of pure, cold, tactical execution. You do not fight a corporate law firm by arguing with them. You give the parasites exactly what they want. You give them a contract to consume. You just ensure the document is laced with a systemic poison they will not notice until it is far too late to spit it out. I stood up and walked to my living room. I retrieved my laptop from my work bag and carried it back to the cedar table. I opened the screen, and the bright light illuminated my face. I did not open my email to contact a defense attorney. I did not draft a frantic plea to the local police department. I opened a blank word processing document. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the familiar sting of the dry red clay embedded in my skin. If Winston required a signed legal agreement to secure his golden child's fraudulent empire, I would give him one. I began typing the header of a very specific, carefully constructed legal trap. The evening air was thick with humidity when I parked my truck at the end of the sweeping circular driveway. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the white-pillared colonial estate. The driveway was crowded with luxury vehicles: Aunt Patricia's silver sedan, Uncle Robert's imported coupe. The familiar vehicles of my extended family lined the pristine landscaping like a blockade. Vivian had not merely organized a dinner, she had convened a tribunal. I carried my canvas workbag over my shoulder. Inside, resting against the worn fabric, was the heavy ivory cardstock contract I had printed at dawn. I pushed open the heavy oak front door. The foyer smelled of roasted rosemary, expensive wine, and polished wood. The low murmur of polite, hushed conversation drifted from the formal dining room down the hall. As my boots struck the hardwood floor, the murmuring ceased. I turned the corner and stood in the arched doorway. The mahogany dining table was set for 12. The good china had been brought out. Crystal wine glasses caught the golden light from the chandelier overhead. My aunts, uncles, and older cousins sat in straight-backed velvet chairs. As I appeared in the doorway, every eye turned toward me. The silence was heavy and deeply judgmental. I could see the pity and the manufactured disappointment etched into their features. Aunt Patricia gave a soft, tragic sigh and looked down at her plate. Uncle Robert tightened his jaw. They had all listened to Vivian's voicemails. They all believed I was a broken, addicted extortionist arriving to beg for a bailout. Vivian sat at the head of the table. She wore a dark, elegant dress, playing the role of the exhausted but benevolent matriarch. Winston sat to her right, his face a stoic mask of corporate authority. At the opposite end of the mahogany table sat Savannah. She was wearing a tailored silk blouse. Her blonde hair was pinned back in a style that mimicked professional sophistication. She held a crystal wine glass by the stem, her manicured fingers tapping lightly against the delicate rim. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated smugness. She believed she had already won. She believed the $15 million acquisition was a certainty, and I was just the final minor hurdle to clear before she cashed the check. Evelyn, Vivian said. Her voice was pitched low, vibrating with manufactured sorrow for the audience. We are so glad you decided to join us. Please take the empty seat next to Patricia. We were just discussing Savannah's incredible upcoming milestone. I did not react to the condescension. I walked to the empty chair and sat down. I placed my canvas bag on the floor directly beside my feet. The dinner service began. The caterers moved silently around the room, serving roasted lamb and spring vegetables. I ate methodically. I did not speak. My silence was interpreted by the room exactly as Vivian intended. The relatives assumed I was quiet out of profound shame. They cast sidelong glances at me while praising Savannah's visionary brilliance. It is just remarkable, Savannah, Aunt Patricia gushed, raising her glass. An eco-startup on the verge of a corporate buyout at your age. We are all so proud of the empire you are building. It takes true genius to engineer a sustainable solution like that seed formula. Savannah smiled coyly. She took a sip of her wine. Thank you, Aunt Patricia. It has been a grueling journey. Innovation always requires sacrifice. She looked directly at me when she said the word sacrifice. It was a taunt. She was flaunting her stolen prize in plain sight, knowing I was trapped by the narrative Vivian had spun. Winston watched the exchange with cool approval. He was analyzing my silence, calculating that his legal bludgeon had successfully neutralized me. When the plates were cleared, Vivian tapped her silver spoon against her crystal glass. The sharp ringing sound brought the dining room to a quiet halt. She stood up. Family. Vivian began placing her hands on the edge of the table. We gathered tonight to celebrate Savannah's bright future, but we are also here to heal. Families go through dark seasons. They face trials. And right now, our Evelyn is in the middle of a very dark season. Aunt Patricia nodded in solemn agreement. Uncle Robert looked at the ceiling. I sat perfectly still. My expression remained entirely neutral. I let Vivian build the stage. I let her construct the narrative trap that was about to snap shut on her own neck. Evelyn has made some severe financial mistakes, Vivian continued, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. The debts have spiraled. We know about the struggles. We know about the poor choices. It broke our hearts when she tried to blame her own family for the ruin she brought upon herself. But a mother never abandons her child. A father never closes the door. Winston nodded sagely. The performance was flawless. They were portraying themselves as saints to insulate their own federal crimes. "We cannot let Evelyn drown in her own mistakes," Vivian said, projecting her voice to reach the furthest corners of the room. "And we cannot let those mistakes cast a shadow over the beautiful company Savannah has built. So Winston and I have made a decision. We are going to step in. We are going to pay off the $87,000 in outstanding debt Evelyn has accrued. We are going to wipe the slate clean and give her a chance to start over." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the relatives. Aunt Patricia wiped a tear from her eye. The sheer generosity of the gesture overwhelmed them. They believed they were witnessing profound grace. Vivian turned her gaze toward me. The maternal warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, triumphant glare. "All we ask in return, Evelyn, is that you sign a standard family agreement," Vivian said. "Just a simple document that puts an end to the baseless threats and the hostility. A document that acknowledges Savannah's sole ownership of Verdant Future Holdings, so the corporate buyers feel secure finalizing their deal on Friday. It is a fresh start for you and a guarantee of peace for your sister." The dramatic irony in the room was palpable. The aunts and uncles believed I was a desperate addict being thrown a lifeline. Savannah believed she was securing her $15 million payout. Winston believed his cease and desist threat had forced my surrender. They all thought I was backed into a corner with no option but to sign my own execution order. Vivian reached into a leather portfolio resting on the table beside her plate. She pulled out a thin, stapled document. It was cheap, standard printer paper. It was a generic, non-disclosure agreement, likely printed directly from an email attachment Winston's lawyers had sent. She slid the cheap document across the polished mahogany. The paper glided over the wood and came to a stop directly in front of my empty plate. Vivian set a silver fountain pen down next to it. "Sign the paper," Evelyn Winston commanded quietly from the head of the table. "Take the help we are offering. Do the right thing for your sister." The entire dining room held its breath. 12 pairs of eyes were fixed on me. They were waiting for me to pick up the silver pen, sign away the last 6 years of my life, and accept my role as the broken, indebted failure. I looked down at the cheap printer paper. Then I looked up at Savannah. She was grinning a vicious, triumphant smirk, pulling at the corners of her mouth. I did not reach for the silver pen. I raised my right hand and casually pushed Vivian's generic non-disclosure agreement aside. It slid off the edge of the mahogany table and fluttered to the hardwood floor. A sharp collective intake of breath echoed around the room. Aunt Patricia gasped. Winston's jaw locked. I reached down to the floor. I opened my canvas work bag. I slid my fingers over the heavy, textured ivory cardstock. I pulled the thick, dense investment and liability transfer contract out of the bag. The paper carried the exact visual weight of Winston's elite corporate law firm. I placed the thick document squarely on the table in front of me. "I appreciate the offer to pay off the debt," I said. My voice was calm, clear, and perfectly steady. It cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "But I cannot sign a generic waiver. This is a complex corporate acquisition. The global conglomerate buying Savannah's company requires strict liability indemnification. Winston's attorneys sent me a formal packet. I have reviewed the terms, and I brought my own transfer agreement to ensure the debt assignment is handled properly." Winston's eyes narrowed. He recognized the heavy ivory cardstock. He recognized the specific font and the formatting. He assumed I had simply taken the document his lawyers had drafted, perhaps adding a minor request, and brought it back to finalize the surrender. I slid the thick ivory contract down the length of the long mahogany table. It passed the crystal wine glasses. It passed the floral arrangements. It came to a stop directly in front of Savannah. "I will accept the debt," I stated, looking directly into Savannah's eyes. "I will walk away. I have only added one minor stipulation. I am requesting a 1% royalty on future net profits, structured as compensation for my past consulting regarding the soil pH balances. 1%. You keep the 99%. You keep the $15 million buyout. You just sign this document and the intellectual property is yours forever, with a clean title." Savannah looked down at the thick contract. Then she looked at Vivian. Vivian let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "A 1% royalty. She wants a little consulting fee for playing in the mud." She looked at Winston. Winston gave a curt, dismissive nod. He was willing to part with a single percent to secure the $15 million acquisition. He believed his legal bludgeon had worked perfectly. I was surrendering, begging for a pathetic crumb. "Sign it, Savannah," Vivian instructed smoothly. "Let your sister have her tiny royalty. It is a small price to pay to cure this family of this ridiculous drama." Savannah picked up her own expensive pen. She did not flip past the first page. She did not read the dense definitions buried in subsection C. She did not read the indemnification clauses holding her liable for the forged notary stamp. She was blinded by the radiant light of a $15 million payday. She saw a document that handed her an empire, and she was far too eager to claim it. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on my lap, and watched my sister uncap her pen. The Alabama evening air felt thick enough to drown in as I navigated my dusty work truck up the sweeping circular driveway of my parents' estate. The crushed gravel crunched loud and rhythmic beneath my tires, an ugly sound interrupting the curated peace of the neighborhood. The perimeter of the driveway was lined with expensive imported vehicles: Aunt Elaine's pristine silver crossover, Uncle Preston's dark luxury sedan. Vivian had not merely arranged a family meal, she had convened a tribunal. I parked at the far edge of the concrete, isolating my weathered truck from the gleaming luxury cars. I turned off the ignition. I slung my canvas work bag over my shoulder. The weight of the heavy ivory cardstock contract resting inside pressed against my hip. It was the physical anchor keeping my mind sharp. I climbed the brick steps and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The grand foyer smelled of roasted lamb, expensive floral arrangements, and polished mahogany. A low, polite hum of conversation drifted down the hallway from the formal dining room. I walked forward. My heavy boots clicked against the hardwood floors. As my shadow fell across the arched dining room doorway, the conversation died. The sudden silence was not respectful. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a jury assessing the accused. The long dining table was set for 14. The good crystal sparkled under the warm glow of the overhead chandelier. Aunts, uncles, and older cousins sat in rigid posture, their faces arranged in various expressions of rehearsed pity. Aunt Elaine held her wineglass, her manicured fingernails tapping the delicate stem. A sharp, high clink echoed in the quiet room. She looked at me, her brow furrowed in manufactured sorrow. Uncle Preston tightened his jaw, shaking his head slightly while staring at his plate. They had all received Vivian's frantic phone calls. They had all consumed the narrative of my supposed gambling addiction and financial ruin. To them, I was a broken, desperate extortionist arriving to beg for a bailout. Vivian sat at the head of the table. She wore a dark, elegant silk dress, perfectly cast in the role of the exhausted but benevolent matriarch. Winston sat to her right, his face a stoic mask of corporate dominance. At the opposite end of the table sat Savannah. She wore a tailored white blouse radiating an unearned, luminous confidence. She smiled a tight, triumphant smirk. She believed she was 48 hours away from cashing a $15 million check. She viewed me as a minor defeated hurdle. "Evelyn," Vivian said. Her voice was pitched low, vibrating with sorrow designed specifically for the audience. "We are so glad you decided to join us. Please take the empty seat next to your Uncle Preston. We were just discussing Savannah's upcoming corporate milestone." I did not react to the condescension. I walked to the empty velvet chair, sat down, and placed my canvas bag on the floor directly beside my boots. The dinner service commenced. The caterers moved silently around the room, pouring wine and serving courses of spring vegetables and roasted meat. The meal was an exercise in psychological endurance. I ate methodically. I remained entirely silent. My stoicism was interpreted by the room exactly as Vivian intended. The relatives assumed I was quiet out of profound, crushing shame. The conversation flowed around me, carefully constructed to highlight my failure by amplifying Savannah's success. "It is just remarkable," Savannah Aunt Elaine gushed, raising her crystal glass. "An eco-startup on the verge of a corporate buyout at your age. We are all so proud of the empire you are building. It takes true scientific genius to engineer a sustainable solution like that seed formula." Savannah smiled coyly. She took a slow sip of her wine. "Thank you, Aunt Elaine. It has been a grueling journey. Innovation always requires sacrifice." She looked directly at me when she said the word sacrifice. It was a taunt. She was flaunting her stolen prize in plain sight, fully aware I was trapped by the narrative Vivian had spun. Winston watched the exchange with cool approval. He was analyzing my silence, calculating that his legal bludgeon had successfully neutralized my will to fight. The dramatic irony was a sharp, cold current running beneath the mahogany table. They believed I was cornered. I knew I was holding the match that would burn their empire to the ground. When the plates were finally cleared, Vivian tapped her silver spoon against her crystal goblet. The ringing sound brought the dining room to a halt. She stood up, placing her hands flat on the polished wood. "Family," Vivian began, her voice trembling, with flawless theatrical precision. "We gathered tonight to celebrate Savannah's bright future, but we are also here to heal." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the relatives before landing on me. "Families endure dark seasons," Vivian continued. "They face trials, and right now our Evelyn is navigating a very dark path." Aunt Elaine dabbed the corner of her eye with a linen napkin. "Evelyn has made severe financial errors," Vivian said, shaking her head. "The debts have spiraled. We know about the struggles. We know about the poor choices. It broke our hearts when she tried to blame her own family for the ruin she brought upon herself. It hurt to hear the threats." She placed a hand over her heart, closing her eyes for a brief second. "But a mother never abandons her child," she projected, ensuring every relative heard the depth of her false grace. "A father never closes the door." Winston gave a grave, solemn nod. The performance was immaculate. They were painting themselves as saints to insulate their federal crimes. "We cannot let Evelyn drown in her mistakes," Vivian announced. "And we cannot let those mistakes cast a shadow over the beautiful company Savannah has built. So Winston and I have made a decision. We are going to pay off the $87,000 in outstanding debt Evelyn has accrued. We are going to wipe her slate clean." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the guests. The relatives believed they were witnessing profound generosity. They looked at Vivian with reverence. Vivian turned her gaze back to me. The maternal warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, triumphant glare that only I could see. "All we ask in return, Evelyn, is that you sign a standard family agreement," Vivian said. "Just a simple document that ends the hostility. A document that acknowledges Savannah's sole ownership of Verdant Future Holdings, so the corporate buyers feel secure finalizing their deal on Friday. It is a fresh start for you and a guarantee of peace for your sister." Vivian reached into a leather portfolio resting beside her plate. She pulled out a thin, stapled stack of standard printer paper. It was a generic, non-disclosure agreement, likely printed directly from an email attachment Winston's lawyers had drafted. She slid the cheap document across the smooth mahogany. The paper glided effortlessly, coming to a stop directly in front of my empty plate. She set a silver fountain pen beside it. "Sign the paper," Evelyn Winston commanded quietly from the opposite end of the room. "Take the help we are offering. Do the right thing." The entire dining room held its breath. 14 pairs of eyes stared at me. They were waiting for me to pick up the silver pen, sign away the last 6 years of my life, and accept my designated role as the broken, indebted failure. Savannah leaned forward, her triumphant grin widening, eager to watch me surrender my intellect to her vanity. I looked down at the flimsy printer paper. I did not reach for the silver pen. I raised my right hand and casually pushed Vivian's generic non-disclosure agreement aside. I reached down to the floor, unzipped my canvas bag, and pulled out my own thick, heavy ivory cardstock contract. The heavy ivory cardstock contract landed on the polished mahogany table with a soft, authoritative thud. It commanded an immediate visual gravity that Vivian's generic printout lacked. I allowed my shoulders to slump. I lowered my chin, breaking eye contact with Winston, focusing my gaze on the empty porcelain plate in front of me. I let my breathing become shallow, mimicking the physical posture of a cornered, exhausted animal. If they needed a defeated daughter to satisfy their egos, I would construct that illusion perfectly. "I am sorry," I said. My voice was quiet. It trembled just enough to sound authentic. "I am terrified of this debt. The collection agencies have been calling my laboratory. I cannot sleep. I just want it to end." Aunt Elaine let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. The audience was buying the performance. "But I cannot sign a generic waiver," I continued, keeping my tone submissive. "That flimsy paper does not legally bind the creditors to transfer the liability away from my Social Security number. If I sign that, the banks can still garnish my wages. I had a legal professional draft a formal transfer agreement. It ensures the $87,000 is permanently reassigned to Savannah's corporate entity. I just need a tiny assurance that I will not be left bankrupt." Winston narrowed his eyes. He scrutinized the thick ivory document from across the room. He recognized the premium cardstock and the flawless formatting. He assumed I had paid a desperate visit to a local attorney who simply repackaged the surrender into a more formal structure. "What else is in that contract?" Evelyn Winston demanded. His voice was sharp, cutting through the dining room tension. "You do not bring custom paperwork to a family dinner without an ulterior motive." I looked up, meeting his gaze with engineered vulnerability. "I am walking away from the drought-resistant seed formula," I said softly. "I am acknowledging Savannah as the sole managing director of Verdant Future Holdings. I just added one minor stipulation. I am requesting a 1% royalty on future net profits. It is structured as compensation for my past minor consulting regarding the initial soil chemistry. 1%. Savannah keeps the other 99. She keeps the corporate buyout. I just need a microscopic fraction to help rebuild my savings after this disaster." The dining room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The relatives exchanged bewildered glances. Savannah let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was a cruel, melodic sound that echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling. "A 1% royalty," Savannah sneered. She shook her head in theatrical disbelief. "You want a consulting fee for playing in the mud while I built a sustainable lifestyle brand? You truly are delusional, Evelyn. I am not giving you a piece of my empire just because you feel entitled to a handout." Vivian smiled a tight, victorious smile. She looked at the surrounding aunts and uncles, non-verbally inviting them to witness my pathetic final grasp for relevance. She believed I was begging for crumbs from my younger sister's golden table. Winston did not laugh. He operated on cold logic. He ran the numbers in his head. Giving up 1% of a $15 million acquisition meant sacrificing $150,000. To a man of his immense wealth, that sum was a rounding error. It was a negligible fee to pay for a clean, undisputed title. The global agricultural conglomerate was scheduled to finalize their purchase in less than 48 hours. Winston knew that a disgruntled relative shouting about intellectual property theft could freeze the entire deal in corporate litigation. He checked his heavy gold watch. He was tired of this emotional display. He wanted the transaction completed. Sign the document Savannah Winston ordered. His tone left no room for debate. Savannah turned to him, her expression shifting into a spoiled pout. Dad, I am not sharing my company with her. You are giving her a fraction of a percent to cure this family of a headache, Winston countered firmly. It is a cheap price to secure your future. The buyers require a total relinquishment of rights from anyone tangentially related to the research. Evelyn is offering us a legal guarantee of her silence. We are taking it. Savannah crossed her arms, but she did not dare defy her father. Winston was the financial architect of her impending success. Vivian signaled to Mr. Henderson, a retired estate attorney and longtime family friend, sitting near the end of the table. He was a licensed state notary, invited to the dinner specifically to officiate my anticipated surrender. Philip, Vivian requested sweetly, "Would you mind witnessing the signatures? We want everything handled by the book tonight." I suppressed a cold smile. Vivian was so obsessed with legal optics that she had provided her own state official to validate my trap. Mr. Henderson nodded, standing up from his velvet chair. He walked around the mahogany table and stopped beside Savannah. I pushed the thick ivory contract down the smooth wood. It glided past the crystal wine glasses and the floral centerpieces, coming to a rest directly in front of my sister. Savannah picked up the document. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. This was the precipice. If she actually read the contract, if she turned to page 4 and reviewed the indemnification definitions, she would see the poison pill. She would read her own legal admission that the seed formula was sourced entirely from my private laboratory logs. She would see the clause holding her liable for the forged state seal. But Savannah did not read page 4. She was an influencer, not a scholar. She was blinded by arrogance and the radiant promise of $15 million. She saw a dense wall of boring legal jargon and assumed it was just tedious bureaucratic noise. She flipped straight to the final page, searching only for the signature block. Vivian reached into her dark silk dress pocket and withdrew an expensive, heavy fountain pen. The barrel was crafted from polished black resin and accented with gold trim. She handed the instrument to Savannah. "Sign it, darling," Vivian murmured, placing a supportive hand on Savannah's shoulder. "Let your sister have her tiny royalty. Then we never have to speak of this ugliness again." Savannah uncapped the pen. She pressed the gold nib against the thick ivory cardstock. The loud, permanent scratch of the metal tip tearing across the paper filled the quiet dining room. It was a harsh scraping noise. To my ears, it sounded like the locking mechanism of a steel vault snapping shut. She signed her full legal name with a flourishing, dramatic cursive loop. Savannah slid the contract toward Vivian. Since Verdant Future Holdings was technically financed through the credit lines Vivian had fraudulently opened, my mother was listed as the primary corporate guarantor. Vivian took the fountain pen. She did not bother to read a single paragraph. Her hubris was a blinding disease. She signed her name right beneath Savannah's, adding her own crisp, authoritative signature to the lethal document. They handed the contract to Mr. Henderson. He retrieved his official brass seal from his suit jacket. He reviewed their verified identifications, signed his name as the official witness, and pressed his heavy stamp into the paper. A perfect, unbroken blue ink circle bloomed on the page, legally authenticating every single word contained within the ivory binding. Mr. Henderson slid the finalized agreement back down the table toward me. I placed my dirt-stained hands on the edges of the contract. I pulled it close to my chest. I felt the warm, raised texture of the fresh notary ink under my thumb. The transaction was complete. The bait had been swallowed, digested, and permanently recorded in the annals of state law. A collective sigh of relief washed over the dining room. Aunt Elaine smiled, raising her wine glass in a silent toast to family unity. Uncle Preston relaxed his rigid posture. Winston leaned back in his chair, satisfied that his administrative problem was solved. Savannah took a triumphant sip of her beverage, basking in the glow of her impending corporate wealth. They believed the war was over. They believed they had successfully purchased my silence for a singular, pathetic percentage point. I waited for the wet ink of their signatures to dry. I counted the seconds in my head, maintaining my submissive posture until I was certain the legal binding was permanent and unalterable. When the ink was dry, I lifted my chin. I straightened my spine, shedding the posture of the broken daughter like a discarded coat. The engineered vulnerability vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, predatory calm. I stood up from the velvet chair. The sudden movement drew the attention of every relative in the room. I opened the thick ivory contract. I did not look at the final signature page. I flipped backward, passing the overt surrender clauses, stopping deliberately on page 4. I smoothed the heavy paper flat against the mahogany wood. I raised my hand and slowly pointed my index finger at subsection C of the liability waiver. I looked directly across the length of the table into Winston's eyes. The performance had ended. It was time to show them the teeth of the snare they had just walked into. The wooden legs of my velvet chair scraped against the hardwood floor as I stood up. The sound was harsh. It cut through the warm, celebratory relief that had just settled over the dining room. Every relative turned their attention back to me. They expected a grateful, tearful speech from the prodigal daughter. They expected me to thank Vivian for her profound generosity. I did not offer gratitude. My engineered posture of defeat evaporated. I rolled my shoulders back and stood at my full height. The submissive tremor vanished from my voice, replaced by a clear Arctic precision. "Winston," I said. My tone carried across the length of the long mahogany table. I did not call him father. I addressed him as a corporate adversary. "Take the contract from your wife. Turn to page 4. Read subsection C of the liability waiver out loud." Winston froze. The smug satisfaction drained from his features. He was a seasoned executive. He recognized the tonal shift immediately. A hunted animal does not suddenly start issuing commands. He reached over, snatched the thick ivory cardstock from Vivian's hands, and flipped past the signature page. Vivian frowned, her perfect theatrical mask slipping. "Evelyn, what are you doing? The paperwork is finished. Sit down and eat your dinner." I ignored her. I kept my gaze locked on the man at the head of the table. "Read it, Winston," I instructed. "Tell the audience exactly what your wife and your youngest daughter just authenticated." The dining room fell into a breathless, suffocating silence. 14 relatives sat paralyzed, sensing the abrupt drop in atmospheric pressure. Winston adjusted his posture. He looked down at the dense paragraphs he had dismissed only moments ago. His eyes tracked across the heavy black ink. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The stoic, untouchable logistics baron realized he had just authorized his own ruin. "Read it," I repeated. The command was sharp enough to slice through his shock. Winston opened his mouth. For the first time in my entire life, his voice shook. It was a faint, tremulous vibration, but in that quiet room, it sounded like an earthquake. The signatory Winston read, swallowing hard, before forcing the words out. The signatory legally acknowledges that the initial drought-resistant seed coding protein sequence was sourced entirely from the private laboratory logs of Evelyn Hathaway. This research predates the incorporation of Verdant Future Holdings by 18 months. A low collective murmur of confusion rippled through the seated aunts and uncles. Aunt Elaine leaned forward, her brow furrowed deep in bewilderment. "Keep reading," I prompted smoothly. "Read the indemnity clause." Winston gripped the edges of the cardstock. His knuckles turned stark white. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone brittle and hollow, "the signatory agrees to hold Evelyn Hathaway harmless for any future civil or criminal penalties arising from the notarized patent filings submitted by Vivian Hathaway on May 14th. These filings utilized the flawed state seal of Loretta Gable. Savannah's hand went limp. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the floor. The glass struck the polished hardwood and shattered. The sharp, explosive crash broke the suffocating silence of the room. Shards of crystal and dark red wine exploded across the floorboards, pooling like suspended blood around her expensive shoes. Savannah did not look down at the mess. She stared at the thick ivory document in her father's trembling hands. Her engineered smile was gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Vivian snatched the paper back from her husband. She frantically scanned the paragraphs her own signature had just legally bound her to. Her breath began coming in short, panicked gasps. "You tricked us," Vivian hissed, her voice venomous and raw. "This is a fraudulent document. This contract means nothing. You snuck those words in to confuse us." "I did not sneak anything, Vivian," I replied evenly. "I placed a legally binding contract on the table. You chose to sign it without reading the definitions. You were so blinded by greed, so desperate to secure your $15 million payout, that you authorized a formal confession to intellectual property theft and federal wire fraud. That is not my deception. That is your hubris." I reached into my canvas work bag. I bypassed the credit reports and pulled out a single sheet of blank printer paper. Pressed into the center of the white page was a crisp blue ink stamp. It was the physical impression I had taken from Mrs. Gable's desk 2 days ago. I walked slowly down the length of the dining room. I stopped beside Uncle Preston, placing the paper flat on the table where the entire jury of relatives could see it. "This is the official seal of the local notary," I explained to the room. "If you look closely at the upper right quadrant of the blue circle, you will notice a tiny microscopic defect. The brass die is chipped. It fails to transfer ink to a very specific fraction of a millimeter. It is a mechanical fingerprint. It is entirely unique to that single brass tool." I pulled a second document from my bag. It was the original forged credit application I had extracted from the notary office. I laid it next to the blue stamp. My mother bribed the town notary to verify forged signatures on 6 premium credit applications I stated, ensuring my words reached every corner of the room. She used my pristine financial history to hire elite corporate attorneys in Atlanta. Those attorneys filed the patent for Savannah's eco-startup. If you pull the public records for Verdant Future Holdings, you will find the exact same chipped notary seal on the intellectual property submissions. The relatives stared at the documents on the table. The irrefutable proof lay in front of them. The grand illusion Vivian had constructed over the past 2 decades disintegrated in real time. The jury of aunts and uncles looked at the weeping, generous mother and the visionary, genius sister. They no longer saw victims. They saw felons. Auntie Lane covered her mouth with both hands, staring at Vivian in undisguised horror. Uncle Preston pushed his chair back, distancing himself physically from the head of the table. The whisper campaign about my gambling addiction evaporated, burned away by the harsh, illuminating light of hard evidence. "You spent my entire life telling this family I was cold and broken," I said, turning my gaze back to Vivian. "You diagnosed me as too strong, using my resilience as an excuse to harvest my intellect. You convinced yourselves that stealing my future was a noble sacrifice for the fragile child. Tonight, you documented that theft. You handed me the weapon." Winston threw the contract onto the table. He stood up, his face a terrifying mask of cornered rage. "You little fool," Winston snarled, his corporate composure shattering into pieces. "You think a clever piece of paper changes the reality of this situation? I have an army of litigators on retainer. I will tie this absurd contract up in civil court for a decade. I will argue you drafted it under false pretenses. I will bury you in injunctions." Savannah jumped up from her chair. The velvet cushion tipped backward and hit the floor. Her face was flushed, contorted in a desperate, panicked fury. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "It does not matter what that stupid paper says." "Evelyn," Savannah screamed. Her tone was shrill, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are too late. The global conglomerate is finalizing the acquisition tomorrow morning. The lawyers are signing the transfer deeds at 9 o'clock. They are buying the company. They are wiring the funds. You cannot stop a corporate buyout with a parlor trick. I am getting my $15 million. I looked at my sister. Her designer clothes and styled hair could not hide the hollow, terrified core beneath the surface. She believed she was still protected by the speed of the corporate machine. She believed the transaction would outpace my retribution. A slow, cold smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. I did not feel anger. I felt the profound, serene satisfaction of an architect watching a perfectly constructed demolition. The snare was closed. The poison was consumed. It was time to show them the true velocity of consequence. You believe the transaction will outpace the consequence? I said. My voice was a soft, steady current cutting through her frantic screaming. You think corporate law only moves fast when it is securing a purchase. You do not understand how fast those same lawyers move when they realize they are about to purchase a liability. I reached into the front pocket of my denim work trousers. I pulled out my cellular phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the formal dining room. I swiped the device unlocked. I opened a mobile digital facsimile application. I had prepared the recipient contact information hours before arriving at this estate. Felix Thorne, the forensic accountant, had easily pulled the public registry filings to identify the lead acquisition attorneys representing the global conglomerate in New York. Their direct facsimile line was saved in my digital address book. I held the phone above the mahogany table. I activated the camera function within the application. I aligned the lens over the final page of the heavy ivory cardstock contract. The flash illuminated the room for a brief, harsh second. I photographed the sprawling, cursive signature of my sister. I captured the crisp, authoritative signature of my mother. I recorded the perfect, unbroken blue ink circle of the state notary seal that Mr. Henderson had just applied. Winston took a step forward. His leather shoes scraped against the hardwood. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" he demanded. His voice was no longer commanding. It was thick with a rising, sudden dread. "I am introducing the systemic poison to the host," I replied. I pressed the green transmission icon on the digital screen. The application processed the image. A sudden, sharp noise erupted from the tiny speakers of my phone. It was the mechanical, high-pitched screech of a digital dial tone connecting to a receiving server. The screeching static filled the quiet dining room. It was an ugly, grating sound. It was the sound of a $15 million empire disintegrating into digital ash. The transmission progress bar crawled across my screen. 10%, 50%, 100%. A bright green checkmark appeared. The document was successfully delivered to the corporate legal department in New York. I lowered the phone and slid it back into my pocket. "The sequence of events is going to happen very quickly now," I told the paralyzed room. "The acquisition attorneys will receive the document in exactly 2 minutes. They will read the indemnification clause on page 4. They will see Savannah's legal confession of patent fraud. They will see Vivian's authentication of the forged state seal. A global agricultural conglomerate does not purchase tainted assets. They do not wire $15 million to a fraudulent startup. They will freeze the acquisition funds immediately." Savannah let out a ragged, breathless sob. The reality of the situation finally breached her towering arrogance. She looked down at the shattered crystal wine glass and the dark red liquid pooling around her expensive shoes. The tailored silk blouse and the designer lifestyle brand could not protect her from the crushing weight of corporate litigation. She was a hollow shell, and the protective armor had just been stripped away. Winston lunged toward the table, but stopped abruptly. He was a logistics baron. His mind ran the tactical calculations, and he realized the trap was flawless. He could not unsend the facsimile. He could not argue the contract was a forgery because his own wife had provided the state official to witness the signatures. They were legally bound to their own ruin. They had paved the road to their destruction with their own boundless greed. I did not wait for the screaming to begin. I did not require an apology or a tearful reconciliation. The social contract was permanently severed. I reached down and picked up my canvas work bag. I turned my back on the weeping visionary entrepreneur and the defeated corporate baron. I walked out of the formal dining room, down the long hallway, and pushed open the heavy oak front door. The damp Alabama night air felt incredibly pure. I climbed into my dusty work truck, turned the ignition, and drove away from the white-pillared colonial estate for the final time. The resolution was swift and brutal. I did not need to wait for a slow-moving federal investigation. By sending the signed confession directly to the acquiring conglomerate, I triggered a corporate bloodbath. The conglomerate pulled out of the acquisition deal the very next morning at 8 o'clock. By noon, their ruthless legal department filed a devastating civil lawsuit against Verdant Future Holdings. They sued Savannah for breach of contract, intentional misrepresentation, and corporate fraud. Savannah was dragged into a grueling series of legal depositions. She sat in a sterile conference room surrounded by high-priced corporate litigators. They placed transcripts of her media interviews and marketing materials on the large glass table. They demanded she explain the cellular structure of the drought-resistant seed coating. They asked her to define the soil pathology and the pH balances required to activate the protein sequence. Savannah could not answer a single technical question. She wept. She stammered. The influencer facade crumbled under the harsh fluorescent lights of the legal system. She was forced to admit on the public record that she did not understand the science she claimed to invent. The humiliation was total and unyielding. The press obtained the deposition transcripts. The visionary female founder narrative transformed into a national cautionary tale about unchecked entitlement and intellectual theft. Winston attempted to shield his golden child. He deployed his own elite legal team to fight the conglomerate. He quickly discovered the fundamental difference between bullying a local independent competitor and waging war against a global corporate entity. The conglomerate possessed unlimited capital. They buried Winston's attorneys in endless discovery requests, procedural motions, and punitive injunctions. The legal fees drained his liquid assets at a terrifying rate. The logistics baron was bled dry by a predator much larger and much colder than himself. Vivian's pristine social standing collapsed inward like a dying star. The corporate lawsuit became matters of public record. The local journalists in Mobile uncovered the details of the forged notary stamp and the stolen credit lines used to fund the endeavor. The whisper campaign she had launched against me reversed its trajectory and consumed her. The charity boards revoked her leadership memberships. The Historical Society politely asked her to step down from her committee chair. When she walked into the country club dining room, the wealthy patrons fell silent and turned their heads, refusing to acknowledge the woman who committed federal wire fraud to fund her daughter's vanity project. They had done the math. They had decided my resilience justified their theft. Their toxic calculations ultimately destroyed their own foundation. The entire empire they built on my stolen labor sank into the mud. 3 months passed. The sweltering Alabama summer finally gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The leaves on the pine trees surrounding my rented cabin began to turn brown and drift to the earth. The soil rested and prepared for a new cycle. I rested with it. I spent my days analyzing new soil samples' content in the quiet isolation of my rural laboratory. The noise of my former family faded into a distant, insignificant echo. One Tuesday morning, I sat at my cedar kitchen table drinking a cup of dark roast coffee. My cellular phone rang. I looked at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed the name of the local bank branch. It was Mr. Abernathy calling regarding my frozen farm loan. I pressed the green acceptance icon on the digital screen and lifted the phone to my ear. "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," I said. My voice was calm and steady. "Evelyn," the bank manager said. His tone carried a profound weight of professional respect and deep apology. "I am calling to inform you that the underwriting department has reviewed the finalized forensic audit from Felix Thorne. We also received the certified copies of the federal injunctions filed by the corporate litigators in New York. The credit bureaus have officially expunged the fraudulent accounts from your record. Your financial history is pristine once again." I leaned back in my wooden chair. The heavy, suffocating burden of the $87,000 debt evaporated into the crisp autumn air. Mr. Abernathy did not stop there. The bank recognized they had almost lost a prime, reliable client due to their own initial oversight. He offered a significantly lower interest rate on my agricultural loan as a formal gesture of goodwill. I accepted the revised terms. The closing date for the Baldwin County farm was set for Friday morning. The legal restoration of my intellectual property had moved with terrifying speed. I did not have to wage a decade-long war against a global corporation. The conglomerate did the heavy lifting for me. During their aggressive discovery phase, their ruthless legal department tore Verdant Future Holdings to shreds. They submitted the forged notary evidence and the signed liability transfer contract into the public court record to invalidate their own purchase agreement. Once the fraud was documented at the federal level, the United States Patent and Trademark Office suspended Savannah's claim. My own attorney, funded by the clean savings I had built over 6 years, filed my original laboratory logs. We submitted the dated digital timestamps and the exhaustive chemical composition blueprints. The corporate reviewers matched the protein sequences perfectly. The patent was formally reassigned to my name. My life work was legally mine again. My former family was trapped in a legal nightmare they could not buy their way out of. The conglomerate was suing them for damages, legal fees, and intentional corporate misrepresentation. Savannah was forced to declare corporate bankruptcy. Her sustainable lifestyle brand dissolved into a mountain of toxic debt. Without the illusion of the $15 million buyout, her curated circle of influencer friends vanished. She was left alone, facing potential federal indictment for her role in the wire fraud. Winston discovered the harsh reality of fighting a predator larger than himself. To fund his elite defense team against the conglomerate, he was forced to liquidate the vast majority of his regional logistics empire. The pristine white colonial estate in Mobile, the temple of their carefully constructed facade, was placed on the commercial real estate market to cover the mounting legal invoices. Vivian was effectively exiled from the high society she had worshipped her entire life. She could not walk into the country club dining room or attend the hospital charity luncheons without facing the cold, silent judgment she had once weaponized against me. The Whisper campaign reversed its trajectory. The town learned the truth through the public court filings. Vivian became a social pariah, shunned by the exact audience she had spent decades performing for. Before I changed my cellular number, the desperate messages flooded my inbox. Vivian left a sobbing, frantic voicemail. "Evelyn, please," she wept into the receiver. "We are losing the house. Savannah is terrified. The lawyers are taking everything your father built. You have your patent back. You won. Please call the corporate attorneys in New York and tell them we reached a private family settlement. Please drop the evidence. A mother is begging you. Family helps family, Evelyn. Please, save your sister." I listened to the audio file while sitting at my cedar table. I did not feel a sudden surge of guilt. I did not feel the familiar, heavy obligation to act as the shock absorber for their reckless choices. I felt the quiet, serene clarity of an observer watching a storm pass over a distant mountain. They had constructed their own ruin. They did the toxic math, and the equation returned 0. I pressed the delete button on the screen. Then I navigated to the contact settings and permanently blocked her number. I did the same for Winston. I did the same for Savannah. I severed the dead branches from my tree, ensuring the rot could never spread to my new roots. Friday arrived with clear skies and a gentle southern breeze. I drove to the title office, signed my name in sharp, angular cursive, and accepted the heavy brass keys. I drove my dusty work truck down the long, winding dirt road into Baldwin County. The 60-acre property stretched out before me. It was raw, untamed land, waiting for a careful hand. A sturdy farmhouse with a wraparound wooden porch sat near a grove of ancient oak trees. It was quiet. It was authentic. I parked the truck and walked out into the center of the largest field. The afternoon sun warmed my shoulders. I knelt down in the center of the acreage. I dug my bare hands deep into the earth. The Alabama clay was rich and dense. It stained my skin a deep rust red. I rubbed the soil between my palms, feeling the grit and the moisture. The earth is honest. It does not lie. It does not manipulate. If you nurture the roots, the plant thrives. If you introduce a parasite, the host dies. The soil remembers everything you put into it. I had protected my roots from the blight. In the spring, I would plant the first generation of my drought-resistant seeds in this very dirt. I would build my own empire, constructed on undeniable facts rather than fragile illusions. As evening approached, I walked back to the farmhouse. I sat on the wooden steps of the front porch. I poured myself a tall glass of iced tea, reclaiming the simple Southern beverage from my mother's toxic legacy. The sun began to set, painting the vast sky in brilliant streaks of orange and deep violet. The crickets began their evening song in the tall grass. There was no screaming. There were no dramatic confrontations. There was only the undeniable reality of my own hard work. I had traded the toxic illusion of a family for the quiet, profound peace of independence. If you have ever been asked to set yourself on fire to keep your family warm, remember, you are allowed to walk away from the match. Drop the word folder in the comments if you are ready to build your own peace. Subscribe to QT Told Stories. I will see you at the next table.